we're on lecture 6, and we're going to be looking, and this is still the poetical literature, and we're going to be looking at Job chapter 12, 1 through chapter 20, verse 29. That's a pretty long section in this lecture. Let's remind ourselves of the three main sections in Job. The narrator has the prologue in chapter 1:1 through 2:13, and then in 3:1 through 42:6. That's the main block of the book. You have Job and the three friends, and then in chapter 42, 7 through 17 is the epilogue or the conclusion, and that's the narrator as well. Also in the dialogue, there are three cycles of speeches. The first cycle is chapter 3:1 through 11:20. Second cycle, Job 12:1 through 20:29, and the third 21:1 through 31:40. Now, different people like commentators. Chapter 3 is really probably a soliloquy and not a response to the friends or talking to the friends from Job. And then once you get to chapter 26, Job has, really in the third cycle, he has several speeches down there, but we'll see that later in another lecture. Okay, so in the second cycle, here is how it breaks down. It's chapter 12 through 20. There is the fourth speech of Job in 12:1 through 14:22, the second speech of Eliphaz in 15:1 through 35, the fifth speech of Job in 16:1 through 17:16, the second speech of Bildad in 18:1 through 21, the sixth speech of Job in 19:1 through 29, and then the second speech of Zophar. So let's get started, and we'll look first at the fourth speech of Job, and this is in the second cycle of speeches, and it's chapter 12, verse 1 through 14:22. And the structure of this is we have an introduction, and by the introduction, I'm just calling that where it just says, "Then Job answered and said." And then his address to his friends in chapter 12, 2 through 13:19, and then his address to God in 13:20 through 14:22. We're going to move through this, but want to point out a couple of passages. Maybe I shouldn't have gone to that slide yet. So let's say if you have a Bible open your Bible to Job chapter 12, and Job is rebuking, it's really irony, rebuking his friends, and he says that I have intelligence as well as you. I'm not inferior to you. Who doesn't know these things? And he says, I have understanding. I have intelligence in verse 3. Literally in the Hebrew, it's to me there is a heart. And that's in Hebrew thought, the heart is the seat of intelligence. And he's probably replying to Zophar in chapter 11, verse 12, where Zophar said that he is an empty man and he doesn't have any understanding. And he says in this speech, in verses 2 through 13:19, he's addressing his friends, and he says, I don't understand, the tents of the destroyers prosper, of robbers prosper, in verse 6. In verse 5, he says that he, and this is a little difficult in translation, the New American Standard has, he who is at ease holds calamity in contempt. The idea is that he is close to disaster. He's provoking God, and it's a thing that's about to slip. He says, whose foot slips. The tents of the robbers prosper. He presents the other side of divine government, and there's the prosperity of the robbers. In a future speech of Job, he's going to really talk about this, how of the prosperity of the wicked. In this section 7 through 25, he talks about how that God is all powerful, but what about his justice? He said, ask the beasts, they'll teach you, the birds of the air, they'll tell you. I mean, God is all powerful, and yet it doesn't seem that he is just, Job says. speak to the earth. And he says, they know these things, that the hand of the Lord has brought this, in verse 9. In his hand is the soul of every living thing and the breath of all. Just like the palate tries words in verse 11, then he says the ear tests words. And he's been testing the words of his friends. I mean, is wisdom with aged men? Is it with the ancient? Is wisdom and understanding and length of days? Zophar is younger than Job, and basically he's saying, maybe, how dare you say you have all the wisdom, since I'm older and wiser than you. With God, there's wisdom and might. He has counsel and understanding. He breaks down and cannot be built up again. He withholds, in verse 15, the waters like a drought or a flood. He, in verse 16, has sound wisdom. It is counsel or might. He leads counselors away stripped, maybe even barefooted is the idea. They walk barefoot. It's a metaphor, but the idea is he strips them of their knowledge. And then in verse 18, he loosens the bonds of kings. The word for bond there means discipline or control. Kings were absolute rulers, but God is the one who's absolutely powerful, and so he loosens the control, the bond of kings, and he binds up their loins with a girdle, with a waistcloth. In a lot of ancient Near Eastern literature, a waistcloth was a badge of a slave, and that might be the idea here. God can turn rulers into humbled prisoners. He leads away the priests who are stripped. They walk barefoot. That's the same term as well. And he takes away the sense of the elders. He pours contempt on princes. In verse 21. The nobles, he pours contempt, and he loosens the belt. And again, to loosen the belt in the culture of that day meant to make somebody incapacitated, because they had long flowing robes and they had to gird them up if you're actually doing something. To loosen them hinders the movement. And he loosens the belt of the strong in verse 21. That word strong normally is like water channels. The idea is to be strong. He uncovers deep things out of the darkness and brings to light the shadow of death. He increases the nations, and he takes away the heart or the intelligence of the chiefs, of the people of the land. God may suddenly deprive the leaders of their understanding and just throw them into bewilderment. And it's in a wilderness, in a wasteland, and he makes them stagger around like drunk men, the last verse of the chapter. As a drunken person doesn't walk in a straight line, they go from one side to the other. So the leaders of the people will be deprived of their reason, and they can't give straight answers. Now in chapter 13, it still is Job's address to his friends, and he says, "I've seen all this." In verse 1. My eyes have seen all this. He stresses that what he's described has come to him out of his own observation, his eyes and his ears. And I'm not inferior to you, and he's already said this in 12:3. He's scorning their pretensions of superior knowledge. And he says that with understanding I speak to the Almighty. In verse 3, and I desire to reason with God. And that's That's what Job is going to say throughout. He says in verse 4, you smear lies. The idea is they are concealing what is wrong in God's control of the world by covering it with a layer of lies. And he says, you are physicians of no value. You are worthless physicians. You are physicians of emptiness or vanity. Then he says, and it would be your wisdom. Verse 6, hear now my reasoning, or my reproof, my argument, and I will speak unrighteously for God, he says in verse 7, in some translations. Better understanding probably is that you're thinking to speak on behalf of God, and you're flattering Him. You're not. The New American Standard translates that, will you speak what is unjust for God? Speak what is deceitful for Him? Will you show Him favor? Will you lift up the face of God? Will you contend for God? Would it be good if He searched you out? In verse 9. He's not flattered, and He would search you out and find out that you are lying. He says in verse 10, He'll surely reprove you. And that happens later in the book in chapter 42, verse 7 and following. The friends are reproved. Shall not His majesty terrify you, and the dread of Him fall on you? He says in verse 12, your memorable sayings are proverbs, they're like ashes. He says your defenses are defenses of clay. Your remembrances are like ashes, and your bodies like bodies of clay, is the idea here. In chapter 13, verse 13 through 19 now, Job he challenges God, and he's sure that he will be vindicated. So again, back to the big structure, 2 through chapter 13, 19, he's addressing his friends. And then in verse 20, he's going to address God. But this is building up to that. In verse 13, in the Hebrew, where he says, be silent before me that I may speak, the pronoun I is emphatic, that I may speak. And he says, why should I take my flesh in my teeth? And why should I afflict myself? I hold my life in my teeth. It probably means I'm at the point of death. I put my life in my hand. Now we come to verse 15, and this is a very famous verse in Job. He says, the New American Standard, though he slay me, I will hope in him. Nevertheless, I will argue my ways before him. There's a problem here in the Hebrew with this. And that is, the Hebrew, as the text stands, says, though he kills me, though he slays me, I will not trust in him. And on the slide there, it says, the present Hebrew text has lo. That's a word that means not, but there's another word, or a preposition, lo, that would mean in him. And so the translations are understanding that that's what it means, and so they translate, though he slay me, in him I will trust. The present Hebrew text has, though he kills me, I will not trust. The Vulgate and the other versions understand the Hebrew is spelled differently and meaning in him. Though he kill me, in him I will trust. Both the translations, King James, though he slay me, yet I will trust in him, but I will maintain mine own ways before him. The New Revised Standard Version understands it as the Hebrew text stands, see, he will kill me, I have no hope, but I will defend my ways to his face. What is the meaning here? Well, in the context, it appears he's saying he can kill me, but I want to talk to him. So you're going to have to make a decision. Is this, as the text stands, it's not a statement of faith, but is it a corruption in the text that should be understood as a confession of faith? Here's what Barnes says. He says, according to the Masoretes, and the Masoretes are the ones that divided the Hebrew Scriptures into chapters and verses. There are 15 places where lo, understood as not. And if you know Hebrew, there would be a lamed with an aleph, is written for lo, that means to him. And that would be a lamed with a vav. And he mentions these 15 places. And he says that the Hebrew text has not, but it means to him. And then he says, on the other hand, lo, that's lamed with a vav, in him is put for lamed with an aleph, that's not. And there, 1 Samuel 2, 16, 1 Samuel 20, verse 2, Job 6, 21. And Barnes says, a mistake of this kind could have occurred easily. So in verse, let's finish up chapter 13 and following. So however you understand verse 15, but in the context, he doesn't seem to have much faith in God. He says, hear diligently my speech. I've ordered my cause. Let the declaration be in your ears. I know that I shall be justified. He knows that he's going to be cleared, but he wants God to speak, and he knows he's not suffering because of some great sin. Yet who will contend me? For then I would hold my peace and die. And don't do, he says, do not two things to me. And again, this is a section where he's talking with God in verse 20 and following. The two things here actually are one and the same thing, that God may remove his afflicting hand and not terrify him with his all power. So don't or withdraw your hand from me, and don't let your terror make me afraid. And then you call, and I will answer, and let me speak and answer me. And verse 23, confident that he's innocent, Job begins his plea by demanding to know the number of sins that he has. Make me know my transgression and my sin. Why are you hiding your face from me? Some commentators suggest in verse 23 when he says, how many are my iniquities and sins? Make known to me my rebellion and my sin, that there is a dramatic pause. And he waits to hear the accusation. But then there's just silence, and so he responds in verse 24, why are you hiding your face and holding me as your enemy? Am I like a leaf that's driven by the wind, is the idea? A leaf is at the mercy of the wind. It's helpless, just blown about. Like dry stubble. And he says that you should treat me the way that you treat me here. Verse 26, that you write bitter things against me, and you make me inherit the iniquities of my youth. The idea is that God make him now suffer for some unremembered sin that he committed when he was a youth. It's like you put my feet in the stocks, and you set a limit for the soles of my feet. And I'm in verse 28. I'm decaying like some rotten thing, like a garment that's moth-eaten. And then in chapter 14, let me see where we're on this. Yeah. Chapter 14 has some famous verses as well. In verse 1, Job says, man that is born of a woman is a few days and full of trouble. The idea is humans are frail because of being created in few days and full of trouble. And he says it's like a flower like the short life of a flower, or like a shadow that's on the earth. He says that's the way the life of humans are. A shadow doesn't remain for a long time in one place. The sun sets, so the shadow declines. And you open your eyes upon such one, and you bring judgment with you. He's really expressing his wonder at how God is so severe in judging his life. And in verse 4, he says, "Who can bring a clean thing out of unclean?" Not one. The point he's making here, I think, is the weakness of being human. He doesn't believe in original sin or being born in sin. No Hebrew would believe that. But he says, I'm a weak human, I'm frail, and you're attacking me. And he says, as the days are numbered, they're determined. Even the numbers of his months are with you. And you've appointed boundaries that he limits, that he cannot cross, cannot pass. So look away from me so that I can rest. He says, if human days are so limited, the numbers of the days are determined by you. You fix bounds, then turn away from me and let me rest so I can just enjoy the day. In verse 6, enjoy the day as a laborer, a hired laborer. The idea is God will relent. He wants God to relent from his cruel watchfulness, and he can enjoy as a day laborer in the evening after the work is over. He says in verse 7, there's hope of a tree. When it's cut down, it will sprout again, and shoots of it will not fail. The tender branches will not fail. I mean, out of the stump of a tree that's grown old and then chopped off, there may come new growth. But he says, for humans, there is not. He says in verse 8, though in relation to the tree, though the root grows old in the ground and the stump dies in the dry soil, yet through just a scent of water in verse 9, it will flourish, and then it will put forth and sprigs and be like a plant. As soon as it scents waters, it will again sprout out like it's newly planted. So that's like a tree. You chop a tree down and maybe the new sprouts. Then look at verse 10 of chapter 14. But man, or humans, die and they expire. They lie prostrate and they expire. And where is he? And in Hebrew, the word he uses here for humans is a word. Well, I have to look. Yeah, it's just the word Adam. I thought it was Enosh. Enosh emphasizes the weakness. And as the waters fail from the sea, so he's talked about a tree, and then he says, but humans die. And then in verse 10, expires, and where is he? As the waters fail from the sea and the rivers drain dry, so a man lies down and does not rise up again. Until the heavens are no longer, he'll not awake nor be aroused out of his sleep. Job says that there doesn't seem to be much hope for humans. And I wish you would hide me in Sheol, in the nether world. He's groping towards some sort of hope that's there. Now we're going to talk later about what Job might have as a hope of resurrection, but it's not very clear. He doesn't seem to have much. And here he doesn't seem to have any at all when he says a tree can sprout up, but humans can't. Verse 14, if a man die, will he live again? If he dies, will he live again? And he says, I will wait till my change or release shall come. And that seems from the darkness of Sheol to some new life, if that's a hint of a resurrection a hope that he has. And you would call, and I'd answer you, and you would have a desire to the work of your hands. But now you number my steps. In verse 16, you even wait for my sin. In verse 17, my transgression is sealed up in a bag. It's sealed up and guarded like a purse that has silver or pearls. You might not lose those. And then you heap up, you wrap up my iniquity. You wrap up. Some suggest the idea of gluing iniquity together for safekeeping, smear over, as some translations have. But the idea is, he says, you're watching me all the time, and he says, surely the mountains falling crumble away, and the rock is removed from its place. In verse 18, the waters wear the stones. In verse 19, after a long time, water will wear away a stone. The flowing wash away the dust of the earth, and you prevail forever against humans, he says. But then he dies. They're brought low in verse 21, and he is not. They become significant, but he does not perceive it. All right, we come now to chapter 15, and that was the speech of Job. Now in 15, 1 through 35 is the second speech of Eliphaz, one of the friends, and this is still in the second cycle of speeches in the dialogue. And the structure of this, verse 1 is the introduction. Then answered Eliphaz the Temanite and said, and then verse 2 through 16, he directly addresses Job. He reproves him. And then in verses 17 through 35, he describes the wicked person and his fate. And so these speeches is carrying forward the drama here. And this is the second speech of Eliphaz. And he is speaking like with a dignified tone of somebody dignified in years. And he really repeats all these same sayings about the terrible destruction and how quick destruction comes on the wicked. And he tells Job that he's blasphemed, and all of this speech is just the same old arguments. So he says in verse 2, should a wise man answer with windy knowledge and fill himself with the east wind, the scorching east wind? When he talks about the wise man, Job claimed that he has wisdom as well. Eliphaz replies that, the kind of wisdom you have is nothing but you're full of air, empty of substance. And this scorching east wind, that's the wind that blows but has no refreshment in it. It brings heat, really. And in verse 3, should he argue with this unprofitable, this useless talk, or with words that are not profitable, with speeches that are not profitable? And he implies that Job has talked for a long time without really producing anything that's profitable. So in verses 2 through 16, he's directly addressing Job. And then 17 through 35, he talks about the wicked man. He says, you're really impairing devotion. You're hindering meditation before God, as you are diminishing meditation because of your blasphemy. You're undermining religious faith in others. And your iniquity teaches your mouth. Your guilt teaches your mouth. And you choose the language of the crafty. You are concealing your guilt, is what he's saying. Your own mouth condemns you. Not me, not I. And he says, are you the first man that was born, in verse 7, that you have all this wisdom? Were you brought forth before the hills? Were you... Rashi, the Jewish commentator, says, were you created before Adam, is the idea? Were you the first created before Adam was formed from the ground, that you know all the wisdom that the Creator has? Do you have all this wisdom that's with you? And he says that you have, in verse 8, limit wisdom to yourself. Were you in the council of God with the company of the angels and the heavenly beings, and you are restraining, you're drawing away, you're reserving, you're limiting wisdom for yourself? Verse 9, what do you know that we do not know? What do you understand that we do not? And both the gray-haired and the aged are among us, older than your father. These aged men. Eliphaz seems to argue that because he's older than Job's father, he is more experienced in life. Are the consolations of God too small for you? Even the words spoken gently with you? This consoling doctrine of God's providence and His care for the righteous, and how that also He punishes the wicked. And he says the words that deal gently with you, the words that allow such words that come out of your mouth. And he may be referring to the idea that I had this vision. Remember earlier he said he saw this spirit that spoke to him. And verse 12, why does your heart carry you away? Why do your eyelids flash? Why do they flash in rage? And the Hebrew word only occurs here. It means flash in anger, probably. And you turn your spirit against God and allow words to come out of your mouth. Such words, these unheard of words. Verse 14, what is man that he should be pure, or that he's born of a woman that he should be righteous? He is saying, you've sinned in some way, and your justice is punishing you exactly as it should. God, in verse 15, puts no trust in His holy ones, and the holy ones are the angels, I think, and the heavens are not clean in His sight, or not pure in His sight. And by heavens, it may refer to the stars, but how he's making a less than to greater than argument in verse 16. How much less one that is detestable and corrupt, like drinking man who drinks iniquity like water. So 2 through 16, he directly addresses Job, and it's pretty strong words. It'll get worse in the book, but that's pretty strong words. Now, verses 17 through 35, Eliphaz describes the wicked man and his fate and the disasters that will come upon him. He says, I'll tell you, listen to me. What I've seen, I'll also declare to you. This has a little bit of condescension of it. The knowledge I'm giving you is by my own observation. You evidently are not smart enough to see this, is his idea. And this is which wise men have told, and they've told this from their fathers. And the wicked, in verse 20, rides in pain all his days. And numbers, the number of years are laid up for the wicked, he says. The sound of terror is in his ears. And at peace, while he's at peace, then the destroyer comes upon him. In prosperity, the destroyer comes. He doesn't think that he'll return out of the darkness. And he's waiting for the sword. The wicked man fails. He's marked out as a victim. The sword probably is God's divine retribution. He wanders about for bread. Where is it? Where is it? He knows that the day of his darkness is ready at hand. Distress and anguish overwhelm him. And he stretches out his hand against God. That's why he is treated this way. In verse 26, he rushes headlong at him. It has the word for neck here. He runs with him with a stiff neck or a haughty neck. And he has this massive shield. And because he's covered his face with fatness, and he has just this fat. He's dwelt in desolate cities. In popular thought, inhabited places that fell into desolation were considered to be because of God's curse, and they were believed by a lot of people to be haunted by evil spirits. And so there was superstition and dread, and those places would be avoided, especially at nighttime. And it was regarded then as an affront to God to rebuild those. And that's what the wicked are doing, he says. He'll dwell in these desolate cities, in houses which no man would inhabit. And they're ready to become heaps. Verse 29, he will not become rich, nor will his wealth endure, and his grain will not bend down to the ground. That's exactly what's going to happen. He'll not depart out of the darkness. Even though he's so haughty, he thinks God will bring him down. In verse 31, let him not trust in emptiness, deceiving himself. Emptiness will be his reward. It will be what is received in exchange. And it shall be accomplished before his time. And his palm branch will not be green. It will become withered and dry. The palm branch was long-lived, and it's a symbol of longevity, yet his will wither and die. He'll shake off the unripe grapes as the vine. He'll cast off his flower as the olive. The company of the godless shall be desolate. And he says they, in verse 35, the last verse, they conceive mischief and bring forth iniquity, and their mind prepares deception. So his argument here is that the wicked man will go to his fate, and God will bring him to his fate. So basically what Eliphaz says here is, Job, you're not as smart as you think you are. You're not listening to our wisdom, and the wicked man will fall. God will cause him to fall. Now, the next section is Job 16:1 through 17:16, and this is the fifth speech of Job, and this is still in this second cycle of speeches. In this speech, he's going to dismiss the consolations that Eliphaz has offered, and he says, you're just sorry comforters. You are really, you're comforters of trouble. The Hebrew says, you're not helping, but you're making worse. You're adding salt to the wound. Will your windy words have an end? So here's the structure, and this is not altogether clear, and Klein's in the Word Biblical Commentary suggest the following structure. Verses 2 through 6. Verse 1 is the introduction, then Job answered and said, but verses 2 through 6 is Job to his friends, and verses 7 through 17, Job to himself. And then 18 through 22, Job to the earth. 17, 1 through 5, Job to God. And then 17, 6 through 10, to the friends again. And then 11 through 16, Job to himself again. So let's go back to that, and we'll begin with chapter 16 and verses 2 and 3. And we mentioned, he says, sorry comforters, that means comforters of trouble, shall the windy words have an end. And he's replying, I think, to Eliphaz's opening remarks in chapter 2, where in 15:2 he says, should a wise man answer you with windy knowledge? So Eliphaz says all Job's talk is like hot air. And then Job says, I've heard these things from you sorry comforters, and will there be an end to these windy words? in verse 4, I could also speak as you do if you were in my place. If I could compose words against you, I could shake my head at you. That's an insulting gesture. I could strengthen you with my mouth, and I could lessen your pain. I think it's probably sarcasm here. He says, you really haven't given me much strength. I could strengthen you as you've strengthened me. Now, 7 through 17 is, Job talks about his pitiable state, and this is to himself, it appears. He says, God, now he has made me weary. You made me desolate. My pain doesn't go away. You've shriveled me up. And it's become a witness. My leanness rises up against me. It testifies to my face. He has torn me in his wrath. It's a picture of like a ferocious animal tearing in fury with the teeth. He hated me. And he says in 16:9, my adversary sharpens his teeth against me. Rashi says Satan is the adversary, but here Job is referring to God, my adversary. And he says his treatment at the hand of God has caused other people to treat him in a bad way. They have... He's handed me over to these people. They gaped at me with their mouth. They slapped me with contempt. He's delivered me to the ungodly. And they gather together against me. He's delivered me to these ruffians. I was at ease in verse 12, but he shattered me. When he says I was at ease, he's talking about the prosperous and happy life he had before what happened in chapter 1. And he talks about how that God is attacking him. He says he's like a fierce wrestler who pounces on the victim. And then he views the picture that God is like an army coming against him. His archers surround me in verse 13. His arrows surround me, and when he shoots the arrows, it goes, he's in suspense, and the arrows whistle by, and then finally he hits him, he says, and then it's like he splits my kidney open, pours out my gall on the ground. The word for liver here. In verse 14, he breaks through me with breach after breach. He runs at me like a warrior, running swiftly against me. He says, I have, in verse 15, sewn sackcloth upon my skin, or over my skin. And the idea may be that this sackcloth is like a habitual garment, and I never put it off because of the sorrow that I'm going through. My face is reddened with weeping in verse 16. And on my eyelids is this deep darkness, shadow of death. There is no violence in my hand, and my prayer is pure, he says. So I haven't cursed God. I haven't prayed that evil should come upon anyone. And so it appears he doesn't understand why this is happening. Now, verses 18 through 22, Job addresses himself to the earth or to God, and that God would testify to his integrity. When he says in verse 18, O earth, do not cover my blood. May my blood be exposed so it can call for vengeance. Blood that's not covered in Scripture was understood to have been violently shed. And you can read that as you go back even to the first murder in Scripture in Genesis 4. of Cain and Abel. And he says, let my blood not be covered. Let my cry have no resting place. Now in verse 19, he says, even now, behold, my witness is in heaven. My advocate is on high. Again, this is another one of the high points. And we're going to see later when he talks about, I know that my Redeemer lives. And this is parallel to that. He knows here the way people are treating him on earth. He doesn't have a witness. He doesn't have one will speak for him. He doesn't have a Redeemer. But he knows that there is a witness in heaven. It's an advocate is the idea, I guess, in a Hebrew court. In Hebrew courts, the idea of a witness was one who testified on behalf of somebody and also saw that justice was done. He is one who will testify to Job's innocence. He will testify on high. And God is the one who knows that he is innocent. So verse 20, my inward thoughts are my intercessors, they're scoffers. My eye weeps. It pours out tears to God. And that he would, in verse 21, that a man might plead with God as a man with his neighbor. That's his hope, that he can come before God and plead his case, because so far he hasn't heard anything from God. And let God himself be the one who will hear me, and he'll set things right, he said. And in verse 21, as a son of man sets right his neighbor, or as a man his neighbor. The phrase son of man is an idiom for just man. For the years that are few are coming on, and I'll go the way of no return. I mean, he comes back and he realizes that, this is going to be the end of me. I don't see God, and I want him to appear to justify me. Now, in chapter 17, it appears it is Job who is speaking to God. And this is from Klein's outline there. My spirit is broken. My days are extinguished. The grave is ready for me. There are mockers with me, in verses 1 through 5 here. And my eye gaze on they're provoking me. Lay down, I say, and you have kept their heart from understanding. You will not exalt them. Then in verses 6 through 10, he says, it's back Job to his friends. He's made me a byword of people, among the people, and I'm one that people spit upon. My eye is dimmed by the reason of this suffering, and upright people will be astonished at this. When neighboring people hear of this, they will be astonished at this, that this has happened to me. But the righteous, he says, hold on to his way. And as for you all, and that would be in verse 10, to all of the friends, all of you, I don't find a wise man among you. I mean, bring your attacks again as you have. He's challenging his friends. Take up your arguments, but you'll just expose your foolishness. Repeat your arguments and their basic argument is, Job, you're guilty of some sin. Verses 11 through 16 then is Job to himself again, it appears. And as we said on this slide here, it's not altogether clear. But he says, my days are past. They're broken off in contrast to the hopes of his friends and thoughts of my heart. They make night into day, saying the light is near in the presence of the darkness. It's always dark. Probably the idea maybe it's darkest, always dark, the darkest before dawn. And the friends are trying to persuade me that soon it's going to happen. But he knows that he's not suffering because of some sin. In verse 13, if I look for Sheol, or the nether world, as my house, any hope of anything, he knows the grave is going to soon overtake him. I make my bed in Sheol. And if I said to corruption, you're my father, to the worm, you are my mother and my sister. Job here is saying that he has close relations with the grave, with corruption, with the worms. Where then is my hope? I mean, death seems to be near. And in verse 16, the bars of Sheol. And the New American Standard just translates that, shall it go down with me to Sheol. But the idea is the bars of Sheol. It's like it's like a jail cell, and it's closed. And he says, when we're at rest together in the dust. And chapter 18 is the second speech of Bildad, and verses 1 through 21. The structure of that is the introduction. Then answered Bildad the Shuhite and said, and 2 through 4 he addresses Job. 5 through 21 he has words on the fate of the wicked. And again, all this seems like it's over and over the same thing, doesn't it? So he, in verses 2 through 4, how long are you going to lay a snare for words? Are you going to hunt for words? And it's interesting in verse 2, the you there is plural. So it uses not just Job, but somebody else. And some of the commentators and the rabbis say that Bildad is beginning by reproving his two co-friends, and he's talking to them. How long will you hunt for words? And he's not talking to Job, lay snares and hunting for words. Consider, and we will speak. And are we counted as beast or stupid in your eyes? You who tear yourself in your anger, and for your sake the earth is abandoned. Shall the earth be forsaken? For you, do you imagine that the established order of the world, where suffering is the consequence and proof of sin, is interrupted in order that you can continue, and somebody will say that you're righteous? Is the rock, shall the earth be removed for your personal wishes? Indeed, the light of the wicked goes out. So in verses 5 through 21 on the slide here, the light of the wicked goes out. The flame of his fire does not shine. And so again, he's back to this theme of what happens to the wicked. It will be dark in his tent. His lamp over him will be put out. Bildad has a lot of proverbs and sayings in his speech here, and he follows the history of human downfall. The light goes out, his final scenes, and then the horror at all that. And he says that as he changes the metaphor now, as he walks, his walk is constricted and narrow, and his evil design brings him down. He's cast into a net by his own feet, and he steps on the webbing, the lattice work that would be placed if you did to trap an animal. You dig a pit and then cover it over with sticks that are like lattice. And so this person falls into that pit. The sinner falls suddenly like a trapped animal. And in verse 9, a snare seizes him. Bildad uses a lot of words for trap and like heaping them together. There's a noose that's hidden in the ground, verse 10, and a trap. Terrors will overtake him on every side. His strength is famished. His skin is devoured by disease. And in verse 14, that from the security of what he trusted from his tent, and he marches him before the king of terrors. And the king of terrors is death. And there he dwells in his tent. Brimstone is scattered all around. You remember in Sodom and Gomorrah, it talks about brimstone in Genesis 19. And his roots will dry up, and remembrance of him will perish from the earth. Memory of him perishes from the earth. He has no name. He's driven from light into the darkness, he says. And there will be no offshoot, there will be no offspring. They who come after will be astonished appalled at his fate, and those who go before will be frightened. And such are the dwellings of the wicked. And this is the place of the person that does not know God. So Bildad's speech here is he addresses Job in verses 2 through 4 of chapter 18, and then 5 through 21 he talks about the fate of the wicked. In chapter 19, 1 through 29 is Job's sixth speech. And here is the structure of that. Verse 1 is the introduction. Then Job answered and said. Verses 2 through 6 is his address to the friends. 7 through 20 is his complaint. Verses 21, 22, again, his address to the friends. 23 through 27 is his wish, his belief, and his desire. And then 28, and that should be not 28 and 28, that should be 28, 29, is his address to his friends again. So look at Job 19 and verses 2 through 6. How long are you going to torment me and crush me with these words? And then he says in verse 3, these 10 times you've insulted me. 10 in Scripture sometimes means it's an idiom for often. Rashi, the Jewish commentator, takes this literally, and he says these there are 10 speeches up to here. With Job 5 and the friends a total of 5. But it may just be a round number. It's been a complete number that you have tortured me and reproached me, insulted me these times. You're not ashamed to wrong me. You're not ashamed to deal harshly with me. And he says, if I've erred, my error remains within itself. It lodges with me. And exactly what the line means there, I don't know, but it seems like he's saying something like that if I'm being punished because of my sin, then it's not known. And you'll magnify yourself against me. God is the one, in verse 6, who's wronged me. He's closed his net around me. Everything is against me, he says. Now in verses 7 through 20 is his complaint. And he says, I cry out violence, but I get no answer. I shout for help, but there's no justice. He's describing how God has afflicted him. He's in verse 8, walled up my way so I can't pass. He put darkness on my path. He built a wall to block my path, to block my way. He has, in verse 9, stripped my honor from me, stripped my crown. And the crown, he means the crown of righteousness. And could be the standing head in the community. He was a wealthy and honored prince. But he's taken my crown, either crown of righteousness or a crown of his standing in the community. And in verse 10, he has broken me down on every side. I'm gone. My hope is he's plucked me up like a tree. He's kindled his wrath against me. He counted me as one of his adversaries, as his enemy. He's assaulting me over and over. And then a lot of these metaphors is coming from warfare. And so in verse 12, his troops come together and they build up their way against me and camp around my tent. He has put my brothers far from me. He doesn't have anyone really who's on his side. Is what he's saying. He's like coming with an army against me, and he's estranged me from my family. My familiar friends, in verse 14, have failed. They've forgotten me. I mean, Job had a right to expect that those who, by close association with him, knew what kind of person he was, but he doesn't see that. Those who dwell in my house, in verse 15. And this could be dependents, could be the slaves that he had. But he says, I called him my servant, verse 16. This could be his personal attendant or one of his many servants. And he doesn't give me an answer. He doesn't answer. I have to beg him with my mouth. Even though I beg him with my mouth and address him softly, he doesn't answer. Now, verse 17, my breath is offensive to my wife, he says. And some translations have strange, but probably what he means is his wife loathes his appearance, loathes who he is, the intimate embrace. I'm loathsome to the children of my tribe, or loathsome to my own brothers. Those who are close to Job are treating him just shamefully. All my associates despise me, rise against me. Even verse 18, young children, in contrast to the honor they had before in the book in 24 and verse 8 and following, even children hold him in contempt. If I arise, in verse 18, they speak against me, they insult me, and this is really striking when you think about in Scripture the honor, how that Scripture emphasizes the honor and respect that children must give to elderly people. And so Job says even children are treating me this way. All my intimate friends, in verse 19, associates, all the men of my counsels, literally what it says, those that he is very close to in leadership. My bone clings to my skin and my flesh. I've escaped only with the skin of my teeth. And that becomes a proverb. I guess it means escape with next to nothing. Through verse 20. Now 21 and 22, Job addresses the friends again. Why do you pity me, O you my friends, for the hand of God has struck me. Why do you persecute me as God does, is to be understood. And are you not satisfied with my flesh? In verse 21, it's show pity, show mercy. And he turns to humans around him, and he doesn't have any kind of strength. And he says the friends are treating him as God has treated him. That, why are you not satisfied with just slandering me? Verse 22. Now, verse 23 through 27 is his wish, his belief, and his desire. And we're going to get into a passage here that's very, very famous, and we'll talk about that. Let me check and see what the next slide is. Oh, yeah, in verse 12, when he talks about God is attacking him as with an army, his troops come together and they cast their way against me and camped round about me, maybe referring to like siege warfare. This is Masada, and you can see the arrows there. And Masada was destroyed in 73 AD, but the Romans camped at the base of Masada, and then they built that siege ramp. And Job is saying God has laid a siege against him. Now let's go back to chapter 19, 23 and 24, and the verses there. Here's how the New American Standard translates those verses. Oh, that my words were written. Oh, that they were inscribed in a book, that with an iron stylus and lead they were engraved in the rock forever. When he talks about engraved in the rock, maybe background behind that is this Behistun inscription, and you can look that up on the internet. But he says, I want my words written, and I want them inscribed in a scroll, would be more accurate, and with an iron pen and lead. And the idea may be that in rock, and then the lead outlines that so it can be read more easily. And there's a close-up of that Behistun inscription. And it's like the Darius, the king, had that inscribed and on the side of a mountain. See that on the side of the mountain there? Job maybe is thinking something, I want, in a figurative way, this inscribed, written down with an iron pit and lead, engraven in the rock forever. Verse 25 and 26, here's the way the New American Standard reads, As for me, I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will take his stand on the earth, even after my skin is destroyed, yet from my flesh I shall see God. And this is a famous passage, very famous passage. So we're going to talk about, spend some time here and talk about Redeemer. In verse 25, I know that my Redeemer lives. That is the Hebrew word goel. And this information, a lot of this information is from the Jewish Encyclopedia online. But the goel is the one who redeems. Comes from the Hebrew word ga'al, which means to redeem. So he redeems and fulfills justice. In most of the Hebrew scriptures, the goel is a fellow human who would be a near relative, and it protects a person from physical and economic violence. Say somebody had to sell some land because of hardship. The goel was to buy that back. In Leviticus 25:25, if a fellow countryman of yours becomes so poor he has to sell part of his property, then his nearest kinsman, and that's the Hebrew word goel, is to come and buy back what his relative has sold. So that's one thing a goel did. Jeremiah in 32 acted as a goel, and when he bought back his cousin's property in Anatot. And he had the deed recorded, and you can read that passage there. In the book of Ruth, the near relative was called to purchase a parcel of land that belonged to Elimelech. Elimelech was the husband of Naomi, and he dies at the beginning of the book. And then Naomi and her daughter-in-law Ruth come back to Bethlehem. And this near relative is called to purchase this land that used to belong to Elimelech. Also in the book of Ruth, another duty, it seems, of a goel was to raise offspring for the near kinsman if the near kinsman happened to die without any. And you see that in the book of Ruth, and Boaz actually takes it up because the near kinsman doesn't want to do it. And this is an extension of the principle of the levirate marriage, and you read about that in Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 10. So buy back land to raise up offspring. Another duty of the Goel was to redeem his kinsman from slavery if he was sold to a stranger or a sojourner. In Leviticus 25, 47 through 55. How close one would have to be as a kinsman is not specified. The brother appears to be the nearest of all. And then after that comes the uncle or the uncle's son. And this is in Leviticus 25, 49. And also, as the Goel had these duties, there were also privileges and compensation. If an injured man had claim to damages and died before they were paid to him, then his Goel would probably have the right to that. We're talking about human Goel now, human redeemers. Also associated with Goel are these cities of refuge. A chief duty was avenging a fellow kinsman if he was killed by somebody outside the clan or tribe. And some suggest this custom is found in very early civilizations. The Jewish law gives the laws about the cities of refuge, and it makes an advance on the Semitic law codes, like even Hammurabi, because it distinguishes between homicide and murder. You read that in Exodus 21, 13, and 14. And it was in order to determine whether a case of manslaughter was accidental or deliberate that the cities of refuge were instituted. The elders of the cities of refuge, a person would show up and they would have to plead their case. And if the elders were satisfied that it was intentional, then the murderer was handed over to the blood avenger. In Hebrew, that's the Goel Hadam. The Hebrew word for blood is Dam. Ha means thee. So, redeemer of the blood, to take vengeance. And even if the elders decided that it was unintentional homicide, the man who had killed had to stay within the city of refuge until the death of the high priest, since the Goel could kill the killer if he found him trespassing beyond the bounds of the cities of refuge. That's Numbers 35, 26, 27. And the whole concept here of the Goel is based on the solidarity of the interest of the tribe and the nation with those of God. And so the idea of Goel became spiritualized, and it came to be applied to the relations between God and Israel. God is regarded as the Goel of Israel. Exodus 6:6, and that should be 15:13, mix there the Roman numeral. But Exodus 6:6, Exodus 15:13, God redeemed Israel from slavery. And the word there is the verb form of the noun redeemer, Goel. And Job 19:25, again, the background is God as the Goel, God is the Redeemer. In Isaiah, God is the Goel. It's emphasized, Isaiah 41:14. Do not fear, you worm Jacob, you men of Israel, I will help you, declares the Lord. And your Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel, your Goel. Thus says the Lord, your Redeemer, or your Goel, the Holy One of Israel, in 43:14. And then 44:6, thus says the Lord, the King of Israel, and his Redeemer, his Goel, the Lord of hosts. Isaiah 44:24 also has that. Here's some more passages. Proverbs 23:11, for their Redeemer is strong. He's talking about mistreating the orphans and the widows. Their Goel is strong. He will plead their case against you. Jeremiah 50, verse 34, their Redeemer is strong. Their Goel is strong. The Lord of hosts is his name. And the phrase Lord of hosts means Lord of the armies. He will vigorously plead their case so that he may bring rest to the earth, but turmoil to the inhabitants of Babylon. And then in Psalm 119, 154, the psalmist says, plead my cause and redeem me. Act as Goel. Revive me according to your word. And he's speaking to God. And back in Job 19, Job says, I know that my Redeemer lives. Some interpreters disagree that Job is speaking of God as his Redeemer. In fact, here's an illustration of that. One person says, the charges that Job makes against God as his adversary make it quite unlikely that even in this notorious difficult verse to translate, that Job wishes to see God as the one who vindicates him. However, as we've been seeing, it appears that Job has wish, he has hope that God is going to do this, and yet at other times he doesn't have that hope. So could this not be a glimpse of hope from Job? He knows that God lives and he will vindicate him, and that God will fulfill justice for him. He doesn't know exactly how that's going to happen. Also here in Job 19, he says that his Redeemer lives and will stand upon the earth. Some suggest at the last there, in Job 19:25, means the Redeemer will be the last one. He'll be the decisive witness for Job. And the Hebrew word for earth, when he says stand upon the earth, is the word for dust, afar. And it can be used for the grave. It's used that way in Job 7:21, 22:16. And is Job talking about that he will stand upon his grave and redeem him? That doesn't seem to make much sense. Or is he talking about he will stand upon the earth? Because it can be used as the earth as a whole in Job 41:33 in the translation. So is Job thinking